Hello humans, it's your host Kory, and before we jump into this week's episode, I just wanted to let you know that my new book, A Well Cared For Human, is now available on pre-order. Depending on when you see this, it might already be available for purchase, but I wanted you to know that the book was out into the world for you. If you've been loving what we've been talking about on the podcast, please check out the book, not only because it's nicely well organized and packaged, the episodes are episodic, and so it's kind of all over the place, different topics for different weeks as they come to me, but the book is nice and organized by section and chapter and really gives you a better overview of what it's like to have an amazing relationship with yourself. But more importantly, I don't know about you, but when I read self-help books, I like to have something tangible that I can highlight or circle or dog ear and keep coming back to, keep referencing, and so that's why it was really important for me to make this book for you. I wanted you to have something in your hands that you could keep coming back to again and again as you needed. And so please check it out if that's something that you're interested in, and you'll find the links to all of that in my description box below, but you'll also be able to go to my website, awellcaredforhuman.com, and check out the links there as well. But let's jump into this week's episode. Welcome to A Well Cared For Human, the podcast that tries to convince you that you are 100% normal and an even better than okay example of the human species, despite the fact that sometimes we feel like the craziest, most incapable, or worthless creatures on the face of this planet. I'm Kory, an author, a creative, and the host of the show. Whatever you're bringing to the table today, I hope this episode proves to be a dose of inspiration for you on your quest to become a well-cared-for human. You can find the episode show notes, your free wellness blueprint, and more at awellcaredforhuman.com. And as always, thank you for listening. Hello humans, it's your host Kory, and this week we're going to talk about breaking generational curses. And I thought of this topic because I saw a really funny video in which a person was sobbing, and above their face it said, "When I think about how I inherited anxiety and depression instead of land and wealth." And it made me think about how, yes, actually, we do have a tendency to inherit terrible things from our families, not just good things necessarily. And so we all know, if we've been following the podcast, that I too have inherited many generational curses. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about what creates those, what keeps them in place, and how we ourselves can break those curses and build different lives for ourselves. And so I want to start by, if you haven't listened to the podcast before and you don't even know who I am, for example, give you a little bit more information about me and the generational curses that I inherited. And so back in 2020, I launched a podcast called Who Killed My Mother? It was about my mother's murder. And in that story, I shared a lot of the moving pieces in place of the generational curses attached to my mother's side of the family. So that was alcoholism, that was substance abuse use, that was all these factors that kept my family stuck sort of in these cycles. There was domestic violence, there was sexual assault issues, so sexual exploitation. There was many things that went into that negative, for lack of a better word, cesspool of my family that was passed on. So it happened at my grandfather's generation, maybe even before his, definitely my grandmother's, down to my mother, down to me. And so it just kept perpetuating itself. And then on my father's side, which I didn't have a specific show about that, but what I did talk about was how he created a lot of issues for me through his narcissistic abuse, but he also was abused as a child, and so it's generational as well. There were people who were struggling with alcohol and substance use on his side of the family as well, also very abusive physically, emotionally, maybe sexually. No one talked about it on that side, so I don't know. But there was a lot going on that side of the family as well. And so in both cases, there were instances where terrible things were happening. It created a lot of mental health issues, poor coping mechanisms, terrible habits themselves, in which they themselves became abusive, and then they abused their kids, and then their kids abused their kids, and so it just kept going down. And so what keeps that sort of dynamic in place, what creates those situations, and then also how can we move away from them? Because obviously we don't want to become the kind of people who continue to perpetuate the cycle. We don't want to be just one more generation of whatever your family name is, inflicting pain upon those who come after us. So thinking about that. Now, in the case of my mother, so she endured pretty severe abuse as a child. She was sexually assaulted at a very young age. And so because that happened for her, she developed a mental health, let's call it constellation of symptoms, of issues. And it was made even worse by the fact that instead of getting support or protection from her mother, it was compounded. Essentially, it was like she was blamed for what happened, even though she was a very young child. And so my mother felt very isolated. She had a lot of pain, and she came out of her situation with this very self-destructive kind of reaction. And that's also part of it, is that in each family situation, people react to things differently. So for example, both my uncle and my mother were abused in similar ways. My uncle became very anti-social behavior. We're talking about like he was psychopathic almost. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't diagnose anyone. I can just tell you that he has some of these traits of people that we consider to have antisocial personality disorder, meaning that he did a lot of crime, he stole a lot of things, manipulated a lot of people, physically assaulted a lot of people, caused a lot of pain and damage and destruction. So that's one way to respond to abuse. My mother, on the other hand, reacted to her abuse very differently. She developed this self-destructive tendency, so rather than lashing out at everybody, well, I shouldn't say that, because she also got into these physical altercations with people. She would try to fight them. She would have very explosive moments of anger as well. But she had more of this turning inward in which she blamed herself, she hated herself, and that was very different than the way my uncle responded to his abuse, which was basically blaming everyone else. It was everyone else who was terrible. My father, too, I would also say that he thought now the world was out to get him. It was the world's fault. It was a bad place. And so my point is that people react to abuse differently, and they develop different coping mechanisms as a result of that abuse. Now, because of the environments that we grow up in, what creates this generational curse? It's got multiple layers. First and foremost, it's the terrible experiences that you had. So what happened to you? What kind of abuse was it? What were the effects of that abuse? How did it affect your relationship with yourself? How did it affect the way you view yourself, how you view the world, how you feel safe in your body, or how you feel safe in the world at large? So it created this experience of living that is a direct repercussion of that abuse or that neglect or whatever the experiences were. And then not only was it that the experience of the abuse for you, then going one layer back was, what did the people do that created that experience? And so what they did was probably either a product of their own maladaptive coping strategies. So for example, in the case of my uncle, his reaction to his abuse was to then, instead of dealing with the feelings or processing them in some kind of positive way, was to lash out physically and to assault other people. And so that's a maladaptive coping strategy. Those of us who would have grown up in healthy environments, those lucky a few of us who grew up in healthy environments, we would have been taught to use our anger in a productive way, or to even just process our anger in a way that does not inflict harm on ourselves or on other people. But if you grew up in an abusive situation where you were not taught that, then you could use this maladaptive coping strategy. So when you feel anger, you don't know what to do with it because you weren't taught any other strategies for working with anger, then you just explosively strike out at other people. You unleash that anger onto others, either by yelling or screaming or hitting them or whatever it is. So that's a maladaptive strategy. Now, if you're wondering why one person would have a maladaptive strategy, such as anger, let's say one person, let's say the grandfather gets very upset, he strikes out at everybody, hits everybody when he's angry, and then the son also learns to do the same. Why? Because you would think sometimes that it was so terrible for him to experience as a child. Why in the world would he do it to other people? Well, part of that is because he had no other examples. So that's what makes it generational. So why does the grandfather do it, and then the son, and then the grandchild? And it doesn't have to be, I know that women can be physically abusive as well, absolutely. In fact, my father was physically assaulted by his own mother often, and so I know that it goes both ways. This is just an example. But why does it continue to go through the generations? if it was such a terrible experience, why isn't our reaction to be like, I'm not going to be like that? Absolutely not. It was awful. And some of us do feel that way, but it's generally because we have then since learned another way to cope with those big feelings. It isn't that the feeling of anger went away. In fact, if we've been abused, we're probably very angry, probably have a lot of anger ourselves. And so what makes that generational is that the person above you or before you, and I want to say above you, those that came before, they had the not only tendency, but also they had no other examples of what to do. So no one taught you what to do with that anger. For example, if you yourself had become physically violent, even though you swore you never would because your parent was physically violent with you, it's because no one taught you what to do with that anger. So that makes it generational, because the people who inflicted that pain on you also did not have the ability to teach you any other skills. And so the lack of skills, and then the similar experiences, the dynamics that continue to go on. So they were abused and violent, so then they became abusive and violent, and then you become, how it keeps going down. So the dynamic is the same, but then also there's no new skills introduced. So that makes it carry on. Now, it doesn't have to be just anger, of course, other terrible experiences as well. So for example, my mother learned helplessness. Now, if you're not familiar with the term learned helplessness, what that means is if you are stuck in a situation for so long, you begin to believe that there's no way out. And we get this term learned helplessness from a study. I'm forgetting the name of the social scientist who conducted it, and it's a terrible study. It makes me mad every time I think about it. But essentially, they put dogs in cages, and then they shocked them, and then they moved the dogs to a different cage, but it was open, so the dog could escape the electric shock if they wanted to. But many of them didn't. They just stayed where they were because they had been conditioned to believe that they could not escape the experience. And humans are no different. We definitely see it in people like my mother, and I'm sure you can probably think of examples too, friends or family, when you're like, why did they stay there? Why don't they try to make different decisions? Why don't they try to get out? Because we begin to believe that we are stuck where we are. We can't make any changes. It's just going to be like this forever and ever. And so my mother, as a child, when she was being subjected to the sexual abuse, and then silenced also by her mother, basically blamed for what happened, she came to believe that, what happened was her own fault, that she couldn't get away from it, because at that point in time, she was helpless because she's a child. However, when you get older, she's not a child anymore. And so she can escape, but she doesn't believe that in any part of her body. And so learned helplessness can also be something that we inherit from different generations. So I also felt very stuck in my situation for a long time. Even though I had not been mistreated in the same ways exactly that she had, I still came to believe that whatever happened, maybe it was my fault and I was stuck in the situation and I couldn't make it any better, because that mentality, that worldview is also inherited from your caregivers. So not just the terrible dynamics, so whether that be anger, violence, substance use, whatever that we get from our family, not just the lack of coping mechanisms, so no one can teach us any differently because that's all that we've ever learned. Not only that, but then also any kind of self-protective mechanism. So things like not believing, for example, that you're stuck, believing that you have power, believing that you can get out of it, believing that this situation is completely shiftable. You just have to have the right skills and stuff. All of that becomes compounded and interlocked and intertwined, and it creates this generational curse. Not just a curse, maybe plural. You might have been so lucky as to inherit many curses from your family, both sides, all of them. They all pitched in. And so if that's the case, how do we move away from it? Right? Well, we need to deconstruct it in the same way that I just did. So one is looking at the poor coping mechanisms, and then also looking at the habits. So staying with my mother's family, for example, my uncle and my grandfather were both very physically violent, very explosive in their anger. And so if you had come from someone who had a lot of anger issues, for example, it's just the easiest example to think of, but whatever it is you're dealing with, anxiety, depression, you want to drink your problems away. You get an eating disorder, like I did, because you feel so out of control that you're trying to control anything you can about your environment just to make yourself feel safer. Whatever it is, first look at the experience itself. So unpacking the experiences, that's one way to shift and to break out of the generational curse. Because guaranteed, the people before you were so locked into their experiences that none of them were able to take the time to think about what had happened. They were just experiencing their day-to-day life, rolling in their big, strong emotions, thinking about all the terrible things that happened, lashing out, hurt people. They were just struggling with the experience of daily living and all of their unresolved trauma. And so no one stopped to think before you, because if you're listening to this podcast, obviously you're thinking about it. You're already moving in a new direction, which is awesome. But thinking about what has got me stuck. Like, what are these family experiences that have got me stuck? Like, what's going on here? Is it my emotions? Are they the issue? Is it the reactivity? Is it impulsivity control? So my mother had been diagnosed with manic depression, but there was also a couple of psychotherapists that I've spoken to since who thought maybe she might also be borderline because she had some impulse control issues. And so impulse control issues, like, do you have any space between when you want to do something and when you do it? Like if you want to do something, do you immediately, like without even thinking, you're just doing it? And so, for example, when I was struggling with my eating disorder, there was very little control or very little distance between my trigger, like I wanted to binge, and then me actually following through with the action itself. And so we got to think about, is there impulsivity control? So what is it that you inherited exactly? Is it anger issues? Is it a tendency to numb out with drugs or alcohol? Is it a sense of helplessness? What is it that you're working with here that you need to look at? So that's the first layer to start addressing. Secondly, what were you taught to do with that? A very valid answer would be, no one taught me anything. And so no one taught me what to do with my strong emotions like anger. No one taught me what to do with my impulse control issues. No one taught me what to do when I feel helpless and when I feel out of control. And so if you have nothing to work with, that's good to acknowledge. And secondly, also maybe look at the ways in which your caregivers or your immediate family dealt with that, even though incorrectly. So for example, my grandfather and my uncle being very physically violent. Well, that's how they dealt with their anger, but it was obviously the wrong way to deal with one's anger, right? Or my mother, she had a lot of strong emotions, a lot of PTSD. How did she deal with that? By drinking and taking drugs. Not the best way to react to your mental health issues. It usually just exacerbates them, drinking and using drugs. And so think about your family members, think about the dynamics, think about the abuse you endured, and look at the ways that maybe you were taught to deal with the things. Because if you were, for example, taught to drink away the pain, realize that you were taught to drink away the pain, that someone around you taught you that was supposed to be a viable way to get out of what you were experiencing. Or even if they weren't specifically drinkers, there might have been some proxy behavior that kind of alluded to the idea. So for example, let's say that no one in your immediate family was a drinker, but you yourself picked up drinking as a way of dealing with your difficult emotions. There probably is something clearly like that, like suppression. For example, if no one in your family ever talked about the things that happened, that's still suppression. That's still numbing out. That's still ignoring. That's still trying to get away from it. And so you just picked a different flavor. If, again, not saying you're a drinker. These are just examples. Think about it however it resonates for you, right? But if it's close in proximity, no one in your family talked about feelings, no one in your family ever dealt with feelings, and then you decide to not deal with your feelings too, but you just did it in this different way with drugs or alcohol. It's still how you taught, this is still a generational curse because it was how you were taught to deal with them. Don't deal with them. Escape, avoid. And so look at maybe the things that you learned from your family that contributes to this cycle of the generational curse because of how they chose to deal with things rather than having healthy coping mechanisms. So in addition to looking at how they reacted, what they were struggling with, anger, substance use, whatever, and then also what coping mechanisms or lack of coping mechanisms did they teach you to work with, look at that stuff too. You're just basically taking inventory of what it is that needs to be addressed. And so once you have a better sense of, oh, this is kind of what was going on, this is what kept my family stuck, this is what kept the generational curses happening down the line. When you have a better sense of that, then you can start to tease apart, like, well, what do I want to create that's different? In order to break this curse, what do I want to create differently? So staying with anger, I just like to be consistent in my example. So staying with anger, grandfather, violent whenever he dealt with anger. Next generation, the child, your uncle, violent when dealing with anger. So you decide, I don't want to continue that generational curse. I don't want to be violent. But I also recognize that no one gave me the tools to address my anger. It's not like my anger is just going to go away. I probably have some pretty valid reasons for being angry. If I was abused and mistreated in this way, of course I'm angry. Why wouldn't I be an angry person? But what am I going to do with that? Because I also don't want to become someone who is violent toward other people. I also don't want to do any other of these proxy habits. So say you don't lash out at people, but let's say you're really hurtful to yourself. Maybe you self-harm, or maybe you punish yourself in some of these ways. So you're still being violent or aggressive to yourself. That's not great either, right? So what are you going to do about this inherent anger and violence that breaks the cycle? Well, now we start looking at different options, and there are as many options as there are people in the world. So you can just find what works for you. This will require a bit of trial and error. So some exercises for working with anger are going to feel very useless and frou-frou to you, depending on how much anger you have. Some of these strategies that people recommend, like, oh, try this when you have anger, you're just going to be, what is that even? It might make you angry thinking about it, about what you're going to do with that. And so be willing to be a little patient with yourself. This terribleness, the perpetuation of this generational curse of anger and violence, for example, happened for decades, maybe 100 years, maybe 200 years. We don't know how far back it goes in your family, right? Don't expect that you're just going to decide, I'm not going to act that way with my anger, and it's just going to go away overnight. Give yourself a bit of grace and be like, this was a terrible thing that I inherited, all this anger, this desire to be violent, to expel this terrible feeling that I have. But I am going to find a different way to deal with this. And then be patient enough to try the different things out, because we don't know what's going to work. And we definitely don't know how soon it's going to take for it to work. So just bring a bit of patience and a bit of realism to the situation. If it took your family hundreds of years working with this and they couldn't do it, don't expect yourself to be able to do it in like a day or a week or a month or a year even, maybe. Just let it be something that you work on consistently. Just make a promise to yourself that, it's going to stop with me. And so if I have people following me, if I have children of my own, or even if I just have other people in my family, nieces, nephews, friends even, bring the friends into it. I don't want to be the kind of person who perpetuates this, and so I'm dedicated to learning how to live a different way, even if that takes me a while to do it. The point is only that I'm not going to continue the curse, right? I'm going to break it. But it doesn't have to be just aggressive or violent traits. It can also be those self-destructive traits. So if you're struggling with alcohol use or substance use, or if you just have this crushing sense of low self-worth, maybe the people in your family, just down the line, you felt very helpless, you felt like you don't matter, you felt like you don't deserve to be loved, that you don't deserve to have care, whatever this is. Like, that is what has been going on through the generational curses, is that you continue to find people who will demean you, who will treat you terribly. If you looked back, what you see is not drug use and violence necessarily, but you just see a bunch of unhappy spouses. You and your parent and your grandparent and their parent, they just kept choosing people who did not love and value them as partners, right? That's another kind of generational curse. And the reason why I use that example, even though it's not traditionally what we think of generational curses, so like when we think of generational curses, violence, drug, alcohol use, mental health issues getting in the way, poor coping mechanisms, poor family dynamics, whatever it is, right? Toxicity of all kinds. We don't always necessarily think about how there's this subtler version as well, which is where we just don't love ourselves. Like the generational curse is that we just don't love ourselves and we don't value ourselves as people. So that's what I mean by, like, maybe you chose someone who does not treat you well as a partner, and so did your parent, and so did your parents' parent, and so that is also something that got inherited and passed on. But you can break it in the same way that you break these more dramatic examples like the explosive anger and the violence and the abuse. It doesn't have to be that dramatic to still be something worth getting rid of that you don't need to pass on. And so we do it in the same way. We look at what's contributing to this, what behaviors did I learn from them, what corrupted worldviews are keeping me stuck, how am I going to deconstruct these things, what do I want to do instead, what's the most vital thing I can do now to move me away from that mentality that will break that pattern, how can I make sure that it ends with me. And so looking at those layers, how did it contribute to where you are now, and what do you want the next stage to look like? And so I just wanted to introduce this idea, generational curses, breaking it, and just remind you that if you're stuck in a generational curse, just like that video meme I mentioned, perfectly normal to want to shed some tears, think of how unfair it was that you didn't get land and wealth when you instead got all these mental health issues. But just know that anything, and I do mean anything that you've inherited, whether it's poor coping mechanisms, whether it's really strong emotions, whether it's a penchant for drug or alcohol use, anything can be broken. Anything can be broken and rewritten. It's just about beginning to understand why you're in that. Why did that happen? It's because your family had these tendencies. They didn't learn anything different to shift it. They didn't invest in those ways to shift it. They had no awareness. I've talked a lot about, both in the book and on this podcast, that the key to shifting anything is awareness, that's the first step. You can't fix a problem if you're not aware of it. But if you're listening to this episode, you're already a little bit more aware than your family, at least, because maybe they're not listening to anything, they're not watching anything, they're not reading anything, they're not trying to do anything. So even just that awareness, just keep cultivating that awareness until you can see your problem and see how you're stuck better and better, so you can keep moving away from it. So cultivate that awareness, have a bit of patience as you make these generational shifts. Believe completely, wholeheartedly that anything can be broken. And I do mean anything. Just think about my family. Go listen to Who Killed My Mother again and look at all the ways my family was absolutely entrenched in their traumas and in their toxicity. And if I can get out of that, you can absolutely get out of whatever you're in right now. It's just about being patient. It's just about being committed to making it stop with you. And anything you can do to raise your awareness and try to understand where you're stuck, how you're stuck, why you're stuck, will help you to keep moving away from it. And that's it for today, dear human. I hope you found this episode useful. And if you did and you'd like to write into the show and either tell me something that you're dealing with that you want me to talk about in a future episode, or just to let me know how this episode resonated with you, I love hearing from you guys through any of my social media or Kory at koryimshrum.com. Otherwise, I will be back next week with another episode of A Well Cared For Human, and until then, please take good care of you. This episode of A Well Cared For Human was written and produced by me, Kory Marie. The music was by Late Night Feeler and Esther Abrami. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider visiting my Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to the episodes, as well as a monthly patrons-only Q&A, bonus videos, and more. Not to mention that your Patreon support lets me know that you find value in the show and want it to continue. You can find me on Patreon by visiting www.patreon.com/Kory Marie. If you can't support the show financially, that is okay. You can still subscribe to the show, leave a review of the show, and recommend the show to your friends, not just the neurotic ones. All of this helps so much. And as always, thank you for listening.